We're coming up on Palm Sunday and Easter. Next Sunday will be Palm Sunday. And then the next Sunday will be Easter. It's the time when we commemorate the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. Those are the two major events in Christianity. They are the two main things that Christianity is based on. Now, when you really get right down to it, Christianity is a mystery. We see a man born miraculously of a virgin. We look at the miracles the Gospels report that Jesus did. We see how Jesus was killed. 3 days later, he rose from the grave. He remained on earth 40 days and ascended into heaven. And Christians believe Jesus was a real human being just like we are. But in addition to that, he was also God in human flesh. Some way or another, at the same time Jesus was a human being in human flesh, he was still God of the universe. It's something you cannot explain. And that's been a problem for the very beginning of Christianity. People never could explain it, couldn't understand it. In our gospel reading today, we heard from the Gospel of Mark. People were amazed. We've never seen anything like this. They couldn't understand it. They didn't know what to make of it. In many places in the Gospel of Mark, it reports that people were so amazed that they were afraid. There's one instance where Jesus did a miracle in the town and the people were scared. And they asked him to leave because they were just amazed by it and it scared them. We know from the Gospels that even the disciples didn't know what to make of it. They didn't understand either. Again, the Gospel of Mark especially presents the disciples as being completely clueless. From the rest of the New Testament, we know that many other people didn't understand it, didn't know what to make of it either. They didn't understand what had happened. We see in the Apostles Paul's writings how Paul struggles trying to make sense of things. In some places you can really see him struggling. And that continued on after the New Testament times. In ancient Christianity, it was also true. Nobody really knew what to make of it. How do we explain this? How could it have all happened? And of course, people came up with their own explanations. That's why there's always been so many different versions of Christianity, even back in the early days. From the very beginning, people had different opinions about what it all meant. They tried to explain it, but they couldn't. No one has ever been able to explain it and work it all out. There have been thousands of different versions of Christianity that have popped up over the years, that pop up all the time, even now. There are many different denominations. And even within the denominations, there are different opinions. And if you keep up with the denominations, you know that the denominations are constantly changing their own beliefs. 2,000 years after the time of Jesus, and still nobody can agree on what it means. Exactly who Jesus was, exactly what he did, exactly what effect it had, largely remains a mystery. It remains beyond all our attempts to explain it. It goes beyond anything we can say. It goes beyond any list we can make. Now, sometimes you see Christians who concentrate a lot on belief, what we're supposed to believe. And of course, Christian beliefs come from the Bible, but if you've ever read the Bible, you realize the Bible's not a list of beliefs. The Bible doesn't say believe this, believe that. When you get right down to it, The majority of the Bible is a record of how people have experienced things God has done in the world. People have seen things happening in the world that they interpreted as God doing them. And that's what the Bible really is. It's a record of them writing down and trying to make sense of their experiences. The Bible is a record of encounters people have had with God. It is them trying to make sense of these encounters and explain them. You see, the only way we have to know about God is the things God has done in the world. It is our experiences and our encounters that people have had of God. That is where beliefs are derived from. And so really, beliefs are the secondary thing. The primary thing are the way people have experienced things God has done in the world. A long time ago, we talked about the translation of the New Testament done by a man named David Hart. And David Hart is a Greek scholar, and he spends some time talking about the writing style of the different books of the New Testament. Now, you know, a lot of people today, they come up with the idea, it's very popular within much of Christianity today to say that the Bible is myth, that people sit down and crafted these nice stories. But David Hart says that when you really get down and look at the Greek and the style of writing of these, they're not works of literature. They're written in a very unpolished style, and they're all written in different styles. It's not educated, learned people sitting down and philosophers coming up with myths and stuff. It's average, everyday people. And he says that from the style of writing in the very different works of the New Testament, the very different styles of writing, you see uneducated people, people who are not used to writing, people who are not literature buffs. They're sitting down and they're trying to convey to us something they have experienced. They're not creating literature. They are creating a record and trying to pass down and make sense of experiences they have had. And you see, it is from these things God has done in the world, from these experiences and encounters people have had of God, that we derive our beliefs. Sometimes I think we concentrate too much on what we're supposed to believe, and we concentrate too much on trying to understand and explain everything. Can you explain how Jesus rose from the dead? Can you explain from a scientific standpoint how Jesus healed the guy that we heard about in the gospel reading who was let down through the hole in the roof? Can you explain how Jesus raised dead people back to life from a scientific standpoint? Of course we can't. But we seem to have a need to work everything out and get it in a neat little package. I encourage people, though, keep a sense of mystery about your faith. Quit trying to explain everything. As long as we're human beings here on earth, it will forever remain a mystery. It is a mystery that we're called not to understand. It is a mystery, though, that we are called to follow. Now, we said that what the Bible really is accounts of people's encounters with God, and it is from these that we derive our beliefs. And that tells us in the final analysis that beliefs come from encounters with God. And so instead of trying to rationally think about beliefs and figure everything out. I think what we should concentrate on is our own experiences of God, because that's where your faith really has come from. It might have been influenced by churches you grew up in or preachers you've heard or something, but the faith that you have deep in your heart really comes from your own experiences of God. Think of Moses. Moses grew up in Pharaoh's court. He got married, was living a normal life. You know, the Bible gives us no indication that Moses was a particularly religious man. No indication that Moses ever thought about God at all. But then one day, seemingly out of the blue, Moses had an encounter with God in the burning bush, and his life changed. There's no indication Moses had ever received any religious instruction. It was his encounter with God that changed his life. The personal experience he had with God is what created his faith. The same thing with the Apostle Paul. Paul's not a Christian. In fact, just the opposite. He was going around trying to find Christians and put them in prison. And then one day he had an encounter with Jesus on the road to Damascus. And that's where his faith came from. His life was forever changed. It was his experience with God that led him to faith. And things like this are found all over the Bible. We hear that people thronged around Jesus because of the miracles he did, the healings that he did. People were converted because of their experiences. We read in the New Testament, in the book of Acts, how after Jesus ascended into heaven, the apostles, and then the Apostle Paul, and even others, continued with these miracles. And that's where the birth of Christianity came from. People believed because of the things they experienced. Paul never understood the faith. We can see that in his writings. Sometimes it seems like he wants to just throw up his hands and say, well, wait, I just can't understand it. Let's move on. But you see, they believed because of what they experienced. Their encounters with God changed their entire perception. They believed not because they understood, but because of what they had experienced. You see, we Christians do not believe that God is an idea. God is not a philosophical principle. God is a living being, a personal being who wants to interact with us. Now, that doesn't mean that God looks like us. That's not what's meant by God being a personal being. He may, I don't know. God's a living being, an entity. God is an entity, a living being. God is not a force. God is not a principle. God is not a power. God is a living entity. And he's not isolated off up in heaven. God chooses to interact with us. God chooses to interact with us. And it is by God interacting with us that we know God. And that's what we find in the Bible. Their experiences. The way to know God is through experiences. Christianity is actually a very personal religion. It is about how each one of us encounters and experiences God in our own unique life. When you think of the Bible, what do you think of? I bet one of the first things you think of when you think of the Bible are the biblical characters. People like Adam and Eve, Paul, Moses, Abraham, David, Jacob, Solomon, Peter, Jesus. You see, we don't look at the Bible as being a story of people. We look at the Bible as being stories of individuals. Individuals. God comes to us as individuals. God encounters us in our everyday life. In our own faith, we need to look for encounters with God in our daily lives. Because you see, that's ultimately where our faith will come from. Our faith will not come from intellectual knowledge about Jesus. Our faith will come from encounters with God in our daily life. We all have them. We just don't see them. If you want your faith to mature, what you need to do beyond anything else is open your eyes and see the encounters with God in your own life. There is an account in the Gospels, in the Gospel of John, where Jesus healed a man who had been born blind. It said it was the Sabbath, and the Jews didn't like it that Jesus had healed on the Sabbath. And actually, they sat around among themselves and decided that this guy wasn't actually born blind to begin with. This was just a big ruse. So they brought the guy in and they questioned him. And he said, yeah, I was born blind. They didn't believe him. So then they brought his parents in. Yeah, he was born blind. And they went on to tell this man, look, this guy Jesus, who you say healed you, is a sinner. And this man said, whether this man is a sinner or not, I do not know. But one thing I do know, that while I was blind, now I see. You see his experience. His faith came from his experience. He couldn't explain it. I don't know. I don't know how he did it. I don't know if he's a sinner or not. All I can tell you is that I used to be blind and now I can see. It was his experience. Now, I doubt any of us have had things like that dramatic, happen in our lives. But there's no doubt in my mind that each one of us has had encounters with God in our lives. We may not have realized it, but they have been there. We just need to be open to seeing them. And especially for those of us who are older and we look back on our lives, can we see the hand of God in our lives? Can you see it? What kind of experience of God have you had? Think over the years. Don't make the mistake of thinking, though, that your experience has to be like somebody else's, or like what some preacher on TV tells you it's got to be like. It doesn't have to fit any pattern. A lot of people have it in mind what an experience of God is, and they say, well, I've never had that, so I've never had an experience of God. That's okay. Yours doesn't have to be like anybody else's. Doesn't have to follow any kind of pattern. It's your unique experience of God. How have you experienced God in your life? A lot of people have trouble coming up with those answers, and they always have. And so, to help us with that, I'm going to go back to the early 500s. A guy named Dorotheus of Gaza. He lived out in the desert of Gaza. He was an Orthodox Christian monk. And people had said, I don't have experiences with God. I want to be united with God. I want to have an encounter with God. And so they come to this man and they say that, and he says, the more one is united to his neighbor, the more he is united to God. So maybe we can look at our neighbors as the people around us, sort of like springboards that propel us toward God. Maybe loving our neighbors is the first step toward moving closer to God. But that's hard to do. Because oftentimes it's not reciprocated. In other words, they don't love us back. Or maybe not they don't love us back, they treat us badly. Well, that's nothing new either. The people that were talking to Dorotheus also had that objection, and this is what he wrote. Do not ask for love from your neighbor. For if you ask and he does not respond, you will be troubled. Instead, show your love for your neighbor and you will be at rest. And so bring your neighbor to love. You see, he was of the opinion that it is the act of love that kindles love. It is the act of hate that kindles hate. And it is the act of love that kindles love. So if we act lovingly, whether it is reciprocated or not, it will ultimately have some effect, hopefully. It will have the effect of kindling the same thing in them. But if not, we have moved closer to them, we have acted toward them as God does. Remember one thing I think we forget. The Bible tells us that God loves everybody. Why does the Gospel of John tell us that God came into the world as Jesus? So that the world through him might be saved. Not just so a few of chosen favorites could be saved, but that the world could be saved. Jesus tells us that God sends the rain to fall and the sun to shine on both the just and the unjust. So the more we act like God, the more we try to imitate God, the closer we get to God. And the closer we get to God, the more likely we are to have experiences of God in our own life. Or at least recognize the ones we've had. And so if you feel that your experiences of God is lacking, try doing acts of love for others. That is a good first step to bring you closer to God.